This is the overview video for the immune balance lesson, specifically focusing on diseases due to immune imbalance. So when we talk about immune balance, what we're talking about is you need your immune system to be functioning, but you actually can have problems if it overfunctions. So there's a balance of the activity level, of the kind of aggressiveness of your immune system. But also there's a balance of other things within your body, particularly the bacteria that are found, bacteria, fungus, viruses, protists, all of that, that are found in your body that are good, also known as your normal flora. They have to be in balance too to keep your body healthy and your immune system functioning fully. So that's what we're talking about with immune balance. So we start this lesson with an emphasis on the normal flora and what they do. So a healthy immune system is one that's got a diverse group of bacteria living in and on your body. I will say I keep defaulting to bacteria. It's mostly bacteria, but we do know that there are normal fungi, there are normal viruses, not just bacteria out there, but that's the majority of it. And when you hear discussions and read things and watch videos, they're mostly talking about bacteria. There are other organisms. So you need lots and lots of the good stuff to outcompete the bad stuff. The vocabulary word for this competition is called microbial antagonism. Okay, so, whoops. Get a color that'll show up. There we go. Microbial antagonism. That is, the good stuff keeps the bad stuff from being able to take hold. This particularly comes into discussion in the health world when we talk about the idea of probiotics. Probiotics being a way that you're supplementing those good organisms to help compete the bad organisms. You've really got to watch things that destroy your antibiotic, your bacterial populations, your normal flora populations, like antibiotics. If you take broad spectrum antibiotics, that will kill the bad stuff, but also kill the good stuff. So it's very important to not just rely on broad spectrum antibiotics, ones that will kill majority of the organisms, but shift your antibiotics, culture the infection, find out exactly what's causing the infection, and shift it to a more narrow spectrum drug, one that will specialize in just the thing you're trying to get rid of, and leave all the good stuff unharmed. If you don't do that, you can create a situation of what we call a super infection. Super infections are ones where the balance is off, where you have reduced the good normal flora and created room for the bad normal flora to take hold. So super infections are particularly common after long courses of antibiotics. The most common super infections that we see are candida infections, like yeast infections, which is vaginal candidiasis, and then urinary tract infections like cystitis, which is a bladder infection, which bladder infections can then travel up to the kidneys and become pyelonephritis. Both of these are common examples of super infections. Some of these super infections, particularly bladder infections, are known nosocomial infections. Nosocomial means hospital acquired. So you're in the hospital for some other infection, you're taking a bunch of antibiotics, you kill off the good stuff, you get a bladder infection. Then that bladder infection was not the original reason you were hospitalized, so that's considered a nosocomial infection. So cystitis is a really, really common nosocomial infection because of the relationship between many of the medical interventions, trying to get rid of the bad stuff, but accidentally hurting the good stuff that's in there too. So I brought up the term probiotics. If you look at the foods that are strongly associated with probiotics, like yogurt is a really classic example of a probiotic. What that is a food that has living organisms in it. And most probiotics are foods that are produced through a process called fermentation. So in order to talk about fermentation, it kind of brings us back to the cellular respiration discussion that we started way back in the eukaryotic cell lesson talking about mitochondria. I strongly recommend you go back and rewatch the video on cellular respiration. There is a nice overview. There's another one in this lesson too. That's another one of those pieces of material that it doesn't hurt to hear over and over and over and over and over. You'll hear it, a new thing every time you hear it, and just help to kind of connect all of the puzzle pieces and get the big picture of what's happening. But fermentation is one option for energy production for cells. So the major energy production pathway for most cells is a process called cellular respiration, and it is either 3 or 4 stages depending on what text or what video you're watching. But the process is always the same. It's just how it's discussed. I tend to think of it as a 4-step process for cellular respiration, okay? With cellular respiration and fermentation, you're starting with your food source. Most of the time is glucose, the most common sugar out there. If you have another food source besides sugar, like a fat or a protein, then you can start at other steps within this process. But most of the time, energy production starts with a sugar. And you can take any sugar and convert it into glucose, or take most sugars and convert it into glucose. And so you start with glucose. So if you start with glucose and you go through the first stage, which is glycolysis. And that happens when you're doing respiration or fermentation. That is a universal. Glycolysis is taking the glucose and splitting it into half and converting it into molecules called pyruvate. This, like I said, this process happens whether you're doing cellular respiration or fermentation. That's the way you start if you start with the food source of a sugar. If you can do cellular respiration, most cells will choose to do cellular respiration because you get more energy out of the breakdown of that sugar. So the next stage for cellular respiration is to take the breakdown product of glycolysis, these 3 carbon molecules called pyruvates, and to continue to break them down. And this is a multi-step process of breaking down that initial glucose sugar into basically the smallest particles of waste, which will be breathed out of our cells and out of our body as CO2. And every time you break a bond, you extract energy out of it. So basically, we're starting with the sugar has got all this energy trapped in it, and the process of cellular respiration is breaking down that sugar and extracting the energy out of it bit by bit by bit. That energy is stored, most of the energy is stored during this process, and then dumped into a really cool machine called the electron transport chain in the last stage of this process. And that energy that is being held in these little carriers will get dumped on the electron transport chain, and that energy will get extracted out and used to make molecules called ATP. Remember, ATP is the kind of the cash. It's the energy molecule that can be immediately used by the cell to make any bonds that it needs. Remember that the cell will rip off the 3rd phosphate to take the energy out of it when it needs to make something. And if it has extra energy, it'll stick the 3rd phosphate back on to save it until the next time it needs energy, where it'll take it back off and then put it back on and off and on and off and on and off. Okay, so the process of cellular respiration, here's all of the fancy numbers and stuff that go with it. You don't need to know all of the fancy numbers. I just want you to have that so you can kind of see it before your eyes. What I do want you to appreciate, though, is that 1 glucose is actually used to make 38 ATP in a perfect world. So 2 ATP there, 2 more down here, 34 down here. Okay, I say that in a perfect world because there are several factors that go into play as to control how many ATP you actually get out of it. The first is that this cellular respiration process is happening in the presence of oxygen, what we call aerobic cellular respiration. That's the only real way that you could get a full 38 ATP out of it. If you have a bacteria that can't grow in oxygen, then you can't use aerobic respiration. And in that case, you have an alternative to oxygen that helps in the process, and it's called anaerobic, without oxygen respiration. And in that case, you don't get a full 38, you get a broader range. And yes, this slide has a very broad range. Usually it's fairly efficient. You're in the 20s and 30s of ATPs produced. If you look over at our poor little fermentation, the most that you can possibly get out of fermentation, what you always get out of fermentation, is 2 ATP. So remember, you started with the same sugar, but you only got 2 ATP of energy out of it, as opposed to up to 38 ATP of energy out of it. So most of your energy is being lost, is being wasted. It's just, money thrown away. So that's why fermentation is usually not the preferred thing. So why do we even have fermentation? Well, if you cannot do cellular respiration, like oxygen is not there, or the oxygen alternative is not there, then your cell would die if it cannot produce any ATP. So fermentation exists as the backup, again, most of the time, the backup. When you can't do respiration, at least you have fermentation. It's better than dying. So you take that same sugar and you only get 2 ATPs worth of energy out of it. What happens to those pyruvates is they're converted into something else, like alcohol. This is how all alcohol is made. Ethanol is another word for what we refer to as alcohol. So when you're brewing beer or making wine, what's happening is a fermentation process where the organisms that are in those grapes or on those grapes or with that yeast and sugar, they're taking the sugar that's there and they are unable to do their normal respiration. So they're taking the sugar that's there, converting it into alcohol and taking 2 ATP to survive. Okay, so fermented foods, probiotic foods, are full of organisms that are in there producing, for example, taking the sugars that are in milk and producing lactic acid, which causes that milk to turn into yogurt. So that container of yogurt is full of the organisms that are doing that process. That's why they are probiotic foods, because they're full of living organisms that are doing this process for us. That's how the food is produced. Okay, so this lesson has a review of cellular respiration and a little bit more on fermentation. And then we launch into some discussion about autoimmunity. What happens if your immune system starts going haywire, starts overreacting to things it's not supposed to react to? Auto means self. So autoimmunity is your immune system reacting to yourself as if something in your body was foreign, even though it's not. Depending on what the symptoms are, what disease we have, you've got different targets. So just to give you an example, one really well-known autoimmune disease is multiple sclerosis. And what happens in multiple sclerosis is your immune system starts attacking part of your neurons, a sheath on the outside of your neurons. And so the neurons start getting damaged and you start getting a neuromuscular presentation. So depending on what the target is, you get a variety of different clinical presentations, which results in different names and different diseases. Sometimes it's antibodies attacking things. Sometimes it's the cell-mediated, it's the cytotoxic T cells attacking things they're not supposed to. But all of these autoimmune diseases, and this list is definitely not all-encompassing, but all autoimmune diseases are a dysregulation of the normal activity where your body is attacking something it's not supposed to. With emphasis on the antibody-based things, this is a good opportunity to point out a really neat process that happens in our immune system called clonal selection, where remember that our B cells, each naive B cell will pick one particular antibody that it will produce exclusively for the life of that B cell. And as it's producing this B, by the way, it's called a B cell because it happens in the bone marrow. As this is the very early stages of this, long before these cells are potentially exposed to any antigens in your body, our immune system does a cool thing called clonal selection, where it goes through and it checks these antibodies on the outside of the B cells to make sure that they're not going to be reactive to self things within our bodies. And if they are, then they're killed off, because we are trying to eliminate autoimmunity as much as possible before these B cells are allowed to, start moving around our body and run rampant and potentially cause problems. Obviously, it's not 100%, but considering how rare autoimmune diseases are, especially antibody-based autoimmune diseases are in our general population, it's pretty darn good because we have billions of B cells that are checked. So, clonal selection does a pretty good job of reducing the presence of autoimmunity in our bodies. Okay, and then we finish up this lesson with some examples of diseases caused by overreaction of the immune system. So the first example that I give you is septicemia, in particular septic shock. So the video on the septicemia is very, very, very detailed clinical video that you really don't need to know that much detail. I just want you to get the big picture of it. Basically what happens is you have an infection that gets into your bloodstream and causes an extreme inflammatory response, an extreme amount of immune chemicals being released in your bloodstream, which causes that leakiness systemically throughout your body. And so shock is what happens when that chemical signal, sometimes you'll hear it called a cytokine storm, which sounds very dramatic, but as that inflammation starts going systemic and filling throughout your entire bloodstream, you get your blood pressure will drop as your blood volume drops, which means that that oxygen delivery to your cells won't be as efficient. So your cells will start sending out, we're in fermentation, we don't have enough oxygen, which causes your heart to go faster to try to pump blood. It causes your respiratory rate to go up as it's trying to get more oxygen in. And it can lead to the cells starting to die off because they don't have oxygen. They can only maintain fermentation so long before they start running out of sugar. So those cells start dying off. You can go into organ failure and death. So this is really an over-response of your immune system due to the presence of an infection in the bloodstream. Okay. The next example of an over-response of the immune system that I give you is strep throat causing rheumatic fever. So this also introduces a really important word. Let me write this word out for you. A really important word of the concept of a sequelae. So there we go. So just like a sequel of a movie, sequel is the next one, right? So a sequelae is one infection causing multiple diseases. So one infection causing, two or more diseases. Remember, a disease is basically a set of signs and symptoms. So with strep throat, you start with the strep throat symptoms, and in certain cases of strep throat, you can get sequelae. So if you have strep throat, certain particular strains of the bacteria that produce certain toxins, then you could have the sequelae of scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, there we go. Scarlet fever is due to a toxin produced by the bacteria. So you start with strep throat, and then instead of getting better, you shift into the symptoms of scarlet fever, the very high fever, the rash all over your body. Another sequelae, a potential much rarer sequelae of strep throat is rheumatic fever. Rheumatic fever is an autoimmune response where the antibody, one of the antibodies produced from the strep throat infection, one of the antibodies that matches the antigen on Streptococcus pyogenes, in a rare group of the population, that antibody can actually stick to other things and cause autoimmune response. One of the more common presentations of rheumatic fever is the antibodies attacking the heart and weakening the heart and causing rheumatic heart disease. If you have that scarring on your heart from rheumatic fever, it increases your likelihood, it makes you much more susceptible to endocarditis, which is a bacterial infection of the heart valves and the lining of the heart. So all of those things kind of link together. So it starts with the strep throat, and then in a small percentage of the population can lead to this autoimmune disease of rheumatic fever, particularly rheumatic heart disease, which can then make you more susceptible for endocarditis for the rest of your life. So having your immune system is the reason we're alive, is the reason we don't keel over from every infection. Every time we breathe, we inhale in things. Every time we put anything in our mouth, there's organisms all over it. So a strong, healthy immune system is absolutely vital. But if your immune system starts over responding to things it's not supposed to, or if you get your kind of body, your balance out of whack, you can get a whole variety of different issues and clinical presentations due to that disbalance in your immune system.